Alright, so now I'd like to follow up mine and my brother's video for the Shawshank Redemption and go into the second story in different seasons, which is Apt Pupil, which is a story that has been kind of, sort of criticized in the past, more so the movie, I think, at least as far as what I've seen, where it was criticized for being very sort of unpleasant, and a lot of people kind of shied away from it because of that, but I've always kind of really appreciated the movie and especially the novella for just being like really unapologetically twisted. Like it sort of like what it explores, where it's like the sort of teenage curiosity, but taking that down like one of the darkest paths possible. It just really struck me in a really interesting way, and we're changing up the timeline a little bit, where the novella itself was published in '82, I believe, and the story is set from it's over the span of like about 4 years. I think it's from 1974 to about '78. We see Todd like start at like 13 years old and then sort of grow into like by the time he's graduating and then moving on from that. Whereas the movie is set in 1984, and it's kind of all in this one area with these jarring transitions every now and then from like 1 month to the next. But the passage of time obviously is more organic in the novella, but it's not too big of a portion of the movie. But I actually love it in the novella because it's more disturbing that Todd starts off so young, and like it gives you more of that vibe of it's because I've heard the story described, and I like the sound of this as contagious evil, where it's like the evil of Dusander from the past is like as that sort of comes back to him through Todd, that it's sort of rubbing off on Todd, and he starts going in very similar directions, and their stories, whenever they're apart, their stories are still kind of parallel. But what I really love about the whole concept in general is the idea, and it's something we've, seen before from time to time, but not near as often as the opposite side, where you have the model student being our twisted main character here. Because usually when you have a character that has like this sort of darkness in him that's still this young, there's usually some backstory about how they come from a really bad place or something like that, or they've been made this way. But to see it from the perspective of it's a young person that basically has the perfect life, and like it makes it a lot harder to pinpoint where this internal evil even comes from. So that's always been a really fascinating angle, and I think the contagious evil thing, while I like the sound of it, it's still the thing of there's clearly, from the very start, something inherently off in Todd that comes from God knows where. And just kind of the mystery of that makes it all the more like terrifying and unexpected. So in both stories, the movie and the novella, we do get started off immediately with the relationship between Todd and Dusander and the back and forth, where we know that a sort of game between them is going to ultimately build. But the way they kind of start off, and we get a sense of Todd's character, because like sort of if I remember correctly, it's been a little while, but in the novella it felt more like it builds, especially with Todd being an unassuming 13. You would think the way it builds, as far as he says, "Hey, I just want to ask you questions, and I want you to tell me the stories of what you did," and it does feel more like just a genuine curiosity thing with not a whole lot of darkness in it. Like I said, this is how I remember it anyway. But and then it just as it gradually goes on, then the evil that's behind Todd starts to come out. The more seemingly in control of Dusander he is as it goes on. Whereas in the movie it feels a bit more upfront because Todd spends the whole movie the age that he's at, and you get a sense of that much more quickly, I think. Where the novella has more of this thing. But you can look at it at the the movie does this also. The really appealing thing about this story is how you, if you're reading it for the first time or seeing it for the first time, you really have no idea where it's going, like the next turn, but it just kind of keeps going in all these different directions, and just when you think it's gotten to its peak darkness, it finds a darker path to go down and just keeps doing that until it's over. And obviously the novella goes into much darker directions as it gets to the very end. Like the whole thing with Todd's obsession with his gun is never even a thing in the movie. Like there's even a line in the movie at one point where they say like Todd hates guns. But with it, like that whole aspect being taken out, and the whole aspect of when I say their stories were like parallel for a while, when it start in the movie, you can really see it also like visually the way it cuts back and forth between these scenes. But obviously in the novella also where they start off with like animals. When you get to that point where we see the cat in the oven scene, that gets very vague about what it is. Obviously the novella is much more straightforward, and not only did he do it to one cat, he did it to a bunch of cats. But I do like the ambiguity that the movie did with that, where it's like the cat gets away, but then later on, Todd's like, what stinks in here? To give you the idea that maybe he found a different cat, or maybe he went through with it, or maybe that's just the remaining smell where the cat almost got completely burned. But then later on, there's the lost cat sign. So it's like the way it kind of goes back and forth on that is really sort of wicked in a imperfect tune with the story itself. So even if in things where it's not a direct adaptation of the novella, I like that it captures the nature of the novella in the movie with stuff like that. But then there's the parallel side to that where Todd crushes the bird with the basketball. And then in the novella, this gradually goes into when Dusander starts murdering people, so does Todd. And like I said, there's a whole other dark path there that the movie doesn't go down, but the movie still makes up for that missing aspect by giving it its own, like, twisted touch. Especially when it gets to the end, the way he deals with French, while entirely different at the very end in both things. I still like that they kept a certain, like, twisted turn to it, like, to still show that, like, Todd has something really deep inside him that is just wrong and evil. But obviously in the novella that's much more external, I guess you could say. But before we get into that, just kind of talking about when we get to the very start of the story here, when it's the two of them interacting for the first time and the way it builds. Like I said, Todd's a little more unassuming in the novella, if I'm remembering correctly, at least until we start, his plans start getting more and more revealed, but the movie captures this really well in this particular moment, when Dusander's going to call the police, and Todd just sort of watches him dial with this confidence, like this completely stonewall confidence, like he knows that Dusander's not going to make it to the end of the number before he hangs up. And when he just kind of turns around and tries to play up his American identity and name, there's just, like I said, just seeing, like, the novella really gives you a vivid picture, but actually seeing it, especially through the performances of Renfro, and especially McKellen. McKellen, who's, like, perfectly cast, and also kind of ironically cast given his role in X-Men, but just 2 years later, I think. Yeah, because this is 1998, which was a really good year for McKellen, because this is the same year as Gods and Monsters. So performance-wise, maybe not if entirely acclaim-wise with the reception this movie got, but I still believe that McKellen was praised regardless of how people felt about the movie. That and Gods and Monsters in the same year was a really good way for him to show off what he had. But going into that also, there is, like I said, it is kind of jarring, kind of at the start. Like, the movie kind of has a shaky start, when, like, we keep getting 1 month later cuts, when, like I said, the passage of time in the novella was much more organic as they just kind of went along with it. Whereas we also have some really on the nose stuff when we're kind of still introducing Todd's character a little bit. When like he's in school and he's distracted by what he's supposed to be doing, and he's just drawing swastikas. And it's like that's a little on the nose probably. And they're probably more subtle ways to show off his character and how his character's getting further and further distracted. But and we do also get more into Dysander and how he got to this point in America in the novella, where he talks about like how he's living off like stock dividends, and we actually learn in the novella that those stocks were chosen by none other than Andy Dufresne, directly connecting to the previous story in different seasons. um, but once we get into the more sort of almost like a, because obviously with King, no matter what direction he goes in, you always kind of look for like even just that little bit of a horror element. Because as we've talked about many times when we did the whole series on the short stories, and now we're talking about the novellas, it almost seems like in most of his stories, even if he's getting away from the horror genre, there's still those touches he puts in there, but they don't feel out of place because there's always like a certain horror at the heart of it, especially in a story like this, where even if you wouldn't necessarily classify it as horror, at least directly, like obviously it'd be more in the thriller category, which there's obviously that line's a little thin, but these touches that are in the novella specifically, and the way the movie translates those, does work for the most part. Where in the movie we kind of go into these visions and these transitions. One of the more effective ones would be when shortly after Todd has learned about the showers that they used. And then the following scene where he's actually in the shower at school, and then that transition to where it kind of comes back to haunt him after hearing that story, is a really effective transition. But in the novella, obviously, it's much more vivid, where they both have. This is another parallel thing going on where they keep having nightmares, both of them, only like kind of different kinds. Where Todd's angle is more of like the wet dream angle, where it's like it's there's still something really grimy and filthy about them. Like even just reading them, like you feel like you need a shower immediately. But that also kind of like pushes, like it's those that kind of push him in that direction of, I should probably kill this dude. Uh, Whereas Dusander's dreams are more like when he has the dreams about seeing like the mummified corpses coming after him, and like the car where the window rolls down, and it's like these really vivid moments that are like terrifying, especially with King's description, just how much those images come to life in your head and how truly nightmarish they feel, even when you're envisioning them just after, reading words. It's still there so clearly. And I said, well, I do think it was a good call on the movie's part to try to not directly translate those dreams to screen. I do think it was an effective way to do it, to have like just sort of the visions happening throughout. Even if that might seem a bit obnoxious in style from time to time, I still think it works more often than it doesn't, so it has that going for it. Then you have a really great scene in the novella that would have been really hard to mess up. And I think the movie does a pretty good job of it. It's not quite as terrifying in the movie as it is in the book, but it's the moment when he gets Dysander back in the uniform and gets him to start marching and following orders. And it's perfectly described in the book as he uses a reference to the Sorcerer's Apprentice with the brooms coming to life. And it's the whole thing where Todd basically wants to be in control of him, and you can see as it goes on that it's all sort of like that inherent obedience comes back to him that's like forever programmed in him. Like no matter how many years buried it, just being back in the uniform brought that back. And so we have the moment when it says, like in the book specifically, where he talks about, Todd says, put your teeth in. And the way it's worded is, Dysander did as he was told and put his teeth in. But then there's the Sorcerer's Apprentice analogy, where he made the brooms, but then after a while, the brooms, like, the whole thing was he's in control of the brooms until he's not. And then the brooms are doing their own thing and they're out of control, and that is the perfect analogy for this moment where he's telling Dussander what to do, and then Dussander gets, like, stuck in it and goes, like, he's basically possessed by his younger self. And the way, like I said, I think it's more terrifying in the book, but the movie certainly didn't lighten it by any means. Especially with the way Todd, like, begs him to stop, and he just, like, intensifies what he's doing. That was probably one of, if not my favorite moment in the book, because it's just absolutely fucking insane, really. Like, it's, like I said, that's what I admire so much about this story, is the fucking audacity of it. How it just really goes into this unpleasant territory as much as it can, but in a weird way, that's the appeal of it. And it's like, when you see criticisms saying it's an unpleasant story, it's like, how else can you tell this story but unpleasantly? That's the feel. So this is either gonna grab you, or it's gonna grab you regardless. The question is whether you like that feeling or not. And you don't even necessarily have to like the feeling, but if it affects you in a certain way or in an exhilarating way, is where you can really find the appreciation for it. And the way King is able to do that with a ton of his stories, go in those directions where, if you were to just tell us up front, hey, that's the path we're going to go down, you would want to say, well, I don't want to go down that path. But when you kind of force yourself down that path and take the direction that King is offering to you in his words, then you just keep getting sucked into it. And it's like, this is incredibly unpleasant, and I don't like this feeling at all. Give me more. It's weird. He takes you to a really weird place, especially with a story like this. Like I said, if it can grab you like that, then he's got you in some way. And so, obviously, as I was saying, this goes into darker and darker territory the more it goes on. So eventually the murders start. And it's a pretty big moment. Like, it seems unassuming if you're just watching the movie without having read the book, but if you have read the book, it's a moment in the movie where it's like, it's only exciting if you do know the book going in, where he just looks outside and just sees, a homeless guy out there. And it's like, if you've read Apt Pupil and you go into the movie, the second you see a homeless person, you're like, shit's about to get real. it's about to go down now. We're going down the path of no return, as if it hasn't seemed like we're already there after the uniform scene. And the movie doesn't even take us in the direction of the direction they take in the book, where it's like, Dussander can't even, once he puts the uniform on again for the first time, he can't sleep at night unless he's wearing it. And it's like, that's a really dark direction. I kind of wish the movie had touched on a little bit more, but it's still effective regardless. But yes, then we go down this path where the murders start in. Like I said, it's much more one-sided in the movie, because we just have Dussander and he only kills one person. Like, if I remember correctly, the novella goes in the direction of he and Todd kill multiple people over time. And it's like, when they go down in Dussander's basement towards the end, it's like, instead of finding the body, they find, like, a small mass grave of sorts. And that's kind of an oxymoron, but there's more than one body for sure. Yeah, as far as these scenes go, it is, I like the build-up to it a lot in the movie. And I like the fact that there's a bit more, it's like, I'm trying to see the movie from a perspective of somebody who doesn't know the story, and it's like, it's one of those cases where you may not be quite sure exactly what Dussander's about to do, but if you don't know what he's about to do, you probably have the sense that something drastic is about to happen. And if you can put two and two together, you can probably figure out what it's going to be. You're just not quite sure when it's going to happen and how long this scene is going to go before it happens. So you just wait, especially with having a recognizable actor like Elias Cortez as the homeless guy. And I love that they cast him, because it kind of gave it more, like between the two of them specifically, and then the build up to that I think is really effective. But as far as like the killing itself in the book is obviously they drag it out a little more in the movie because like he's kind of still alive and he like actually stands back up and Todd has to like really work to get him down the rest of the way. But I marked this specifically because I just have to draw directly to King's words to mention. Like I feel like it's doing a disservice to just say King described it really vividly. I need to use the exact example of what I mean by the way King describes this scene. That's really could really just be, he talks to the homeless guy and then he stabs him in the back and gets him down into the basement. But when you talk about King being able to bring vivid images to life, and not just images, but like smells and sound, like he's using all the senses in the text. And it's like in the movie you would think it'd be effective because we're literally watching it happen. But it's still somehow not quite as effective as the way King's... Because King puts us right there. Like, right in the room as it's happening. And a couple of things I just want to read here specifically are... I always enjoy a drink in the evening, Dusander agreed from behind him, and then rammed the butcher knife into the stewbum's neck. There was the sound of ripping gristle, a sound like a drumstick being torn enthusiastically from a freshly roasted chicken. The jelly glass fell from the stewbum's hand and onto the table. It rolled towards the edge, its movement enhancing the illusion that the cartoon characters on it were dancing. And then it's not over. It goes on to the next page, and this little paragraph especially just says like I said, the smells, the visuals, the sound, everything. Dusander yanked the knife free. He had to use both hands to do it, and crossed to the kitchen sink. It was filled with hot water, lemon fresh joy, and dirty supper dishes. So you can smell that and hear it at the same time. The knife disappeared into a billow of citrus-smelling suds like a very small fighter plane diving into a cloud. How much more vivid can that scene be? And going so far as to doing the plane and the cloud thing, like giving you an entirely different visual on top of that, just to make sure you fully get what the knife looked like when it disappeared into the soap. It's like it literally puts you in that scene using all the senses almost. And it's that description really stuck with me the first time I read it. Both those paragraphs, and it's, good lord. And like I said, the fact that the movie, with all the sound and the visuals it can give us, didn't quite portray it that vividly, even so. But then again, with that description, it's like, there's things in there that you couldn't have possibly translated to screen, and the movie did the best that it could. So it's still a harrowing scene in itself, for sure. But that description in the book is a whole other monster for the same moment, really. Though, as it says, it was the neck, whereas in the movie it's just the back. But that could have also been for rating purposes. Because if they had gotten too graphic, obviously, they would have been forced to cut it down anyway, so there was that. Maybe they did, but regardless, that scene's just always been insane to me. So of course there's also going to be some undertones that may not be quite present in the book, at least that I remember, because they're... like, particularly we're referring to like homosexuality and the sort of undertones like that. But the thing is and it kind of goes along also with the game they're playing with each other, where we get, like I said, the sort of homosexuality, like undertones. Sometimes they're very subtle, sometimes they are not so subtle. Like, an example of not so subtle would be when they're doing the back and forth and they're like really starting to, like, the game is really in full force now. And we get the scene where it's like when he's come to the conclusion, like, I should kill Dusander at this point, and we actually watch him register all I have to do in this moment is push him downstairs. This is pretty much directly from the book too. It was translated just about directly, and you realize the game being played here is literally as Todd is putting this together. All I have to do is this, and it's over. Dussander is explaining the should I die side that he is coming from. This made up story about the safety deposit box. And the fact that they're having this battle before Todd even realizes they're having this battle. Because it seems very apparent that Dussander knows what was about to happen, what Todd was thinking there, and so this was perfectly went into his plan of saying, oh, by the way, this safety deposit box thing. So if you're thinking about pushing me down the stairs, you might not want to do that just yet. And then when this back and forth happens, kind of it reaches this peak moment that's very well played in the movie, which I said where these not so subtle undertones might be coming in when he says, Todd says, like, go fuck yourself, and just so arrogant and proud, Dussander says, we're fucking each other. Like I said, that's an example of the not subtle at all. But you can sense that there's also, because that was sort of, I was kind of dancing around saying Singer's name. Obviously that's apparent in Singer's work, especially with him using that, like that was the place where he was coming from allegorically when it came to X-Men. And being outcast and feeling like you don't belong and stuff like that. There's a lot of that in here also that kind of carry over a couple years later. Speaking of X-Men, there's also a lot of the cast in the movie adaptation is really great. Because on top of Ian McKellen, we also have Bruce Davison, who would carry over to X-Men as well. Bruce Davison and Ann Dowd. Ann Dowd, who we're not going to be... This isn't the last time we'll talk about her in this King novella series. Are pretty much perfectly cast as his parents. Like, they don't get a lot to play with, but they have just enough, especially in, like, the dinner scene. Where they just kind of give us the perfect example of us seeing where Todd came from, which once again makes the evil inside him all the more of this really great sort of mystery. But on top of that, we also have Alaska Day, as I mentioned. Joe Morton comes in kind of late in the game as Richler the cop, and brings a strength to that. We have an excellent David Schwimmer as French, especially when he gets into the later. Like he perfectly captures that guidance counselor scene between them when Sanders posing as the grandfather, and then when it's all kind of coming to him. Like, it's much more of an elaborate process in the book, but I kind of love how directly it is in the movie, where like it's literally while Todd is standing next to him that he realizes he's been had. And so that adds a really great tension. Then when it gets to the final scene, Schwimmer was really great in this. So the supporting cast really brings a nice sort of like foundation to it, but obviously it's all about this Brentford versus McKellen game happening throughout it, and they just play off each other perfectly. Especially in this moments where, like I said, you can feel like the game building between them. And there are moments when we get towards the end that actually might translate a bit better in the movie than they do but they're still kind of like the whole investigation aspect in the book kind of felt a bit convoluted to me, and specific aspects like the letter, which isn't as touched on in the movie as it is in the book. Like, it feels like less convoluted in the movie, like because they kind of cut it down a little bit, and so there's just enough there to where we can see what's driving the cops. But like I said, the more nitty gritty details of it in the book kind of felt a bit convoluted at times. So that was probably much better on the movie's part to sort of cut that down. But we also get the turning point when we realize that the patient next to Dussander is a former prisoner of his, whose family he killed. And I do think it's more organic in the book because there's build up to who he is. Like, we get his whole story before he's even in the hospital, and then how that happened, and like who he is and where he comes from and all that. And so I do think it's kind of more effective build up in regards to the book. But once again, I think the way the movie translated that does work. It sounds like if you just say it, it sounds like it wouldn't work as well. Where it's like we just see it, like it almost seems too random. in the movie, whereas it feels random in the book, but at least we have the build up to where it just feels like it's one of those awful coincidences that are necessary when you're telling a story for effect purposes. And it might seem too random in the movie, but I think that the reveal of the number on his arm, I think, is dramatic enough to suffice the build-up that we didn't quite get. So it's like we see what's happening, and we can kind of put it together. But then when that reveal happens of the number on his arm, it's a pretty big moment. So I think that kind of makes up for the lack of build-up to that character. As we go into sort of the final parts of it. And there's a really great scene right before this, the scene where Todd interacts with him. And this is a really great scene for Renfro, because it's like, by this point we've seen Todd at kind of his peak crazy. But the thing is the way he talks to this guy, Kramer, it's like we can see Todd like acting like a normal person, and the fact that we know it's an act for Todd to seem like a normal person to other people, and it's in a really big way in this scene, because if you don't know anything like if you just were on the outside looking in at this conversation, Todd would look so innocent, and like nice and kind, for having this old friend that he comes to visit in the hospital. And like just knowing what's underlying with that in this scene makes it all the more great, and you can really appreciate kind of Renfro's performance here. And there's also a great moment talking about the two sides of Todd, the facade and what's underneath. In the graduation scene, there's a great visual in this graduation scene when we're looking behind. It's outdoors, and we're looking behind him, and so we're like to his back, and we're looking at the crowd, and you can see like these ominous looking clouds. Like it looks like it's gonna storm or something, and it's just like this looming darkness. But then when we cut to the other side, and we're seeing what the crowd sees, Todd from the front, the sky's like perfectly blue behind him, and it's like, so it's kind of that perfect like visual to show off Todd's two different sides, and how the blue sky is what people see when they look at him, but when we can see what they don't see, then it's dark and gloomy. It's a really great visual. Some might think it's maybe a bit too on the nose, but I think it's a brilliant choice. I love those shots. So, yes, then we get to the very end, where obviously there is a drastic difference in how the movie ends versus how the book ends. And I can appreciate both, absolutely. I kind of already went into this, but in more detail. For the uninitiated, I guess spoilers for the book, even though if you've... Yeah. We went on the whole thing about how Todd has this kind of weird obsession with this idea of going to a place and just picking people off throughout the book. And it's and maybe that would have seemed like maybe a bit of a cliche to go into the movie, but I do think the ending of the book is powerful and hard-hitting, and such a gut punch that it is. Probably wouldn't have translated well to the movie under hardly any circumstance, because I think it's the abruptness of the gut punch in the book that the abruptness can work very well in a book in a way that a movie probably wouldn't be able to pull it off. Where it's obviously there's been a lot of build up to this, but the fact that when he does confront French, or French confronts him, and this scene ends with him blowing French's head off, and then going out and doing this killing spree that he had planned, and then there's just like one line that just says, you know, he did it until this particular time, and then the cops took him down, and just like that. And that's just how the story ends. And like I said, the abruptness of that, there's no way you could have pulled it off in the movie, because it wouldn't have had to have been that abrupt. It would have had to have played out. But it's like the abruptness of just summing it up in one sentence at the end of the book is where the punch comes from. And the way they kind of took that out entirely and brought in the blackmail thing might also seem a little bit sudden, but the fact that we've seen how Todd's been able to manipulate throughout the movie and has these different sides to him, I think it's really kind of the perfect way to do it. Like I said, if you can't take the ending of the book because it wouldn't translate well, this is probably the next best ending, because, like I said, it's still obviously it's not, Todd going on a murder spree twisted, but it still shows how deeply, deeply twisted and manipulative he can be. And it's, yeah, so I feel like that's still kind of the perfect ending as far as the movie's concerned. So, but like I said, for both mediums and what they both have the desired effect of where you come from. Because I felt like, because you kind of walk away from the movie going, oh man, that is so damn twisted. But there's like a sort of, like I said, that sort of guilty, like feeling of like this is like I said, King takes you in a direction that you feel like you don't want to go in, and then you end up wanting more. And it's like when it gets to that sort of peak feeling, it's like, ugh, this feels dirty, but also kind of satisfying in a weird way. When you're done reading the novella, at least for me, I was just in a daze after reading it, because after that punch is just so big and so dark. But like that effect is like where the talent of the storytelling comes from. So yeah, at least that's the way I see it. So I think that's pretty much all I was going to address with these. So yeah, like I said, you can definitely see the changes they made for the movie, but for the most part, they really made changes for the better, knowing that, and not necessarily that the choices are better than the choices King made when he wrote the novella, but like I said, as far as like adaptation and translation purposes, they made the right calls and knew what would work and what wouldn't work on screen. So yeah, so I think that's pretty much all I need to say about this. So we are going to finish the adaptations that come from different seasons with Stand By Me next, because obviously the breathing method has yet to be made into something. I want to say I heard something about something being worked on, but I don't know. But we'll talk about Stand By Me, and then we'll talk about Hearts in Atlantis, and then we'll go into Four Past Midnight and Full Dark No Stars. So, yeah, so until those, I think that's it for this.